Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott, in the Lake District today in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar, in Washington, DC, to this, the 53rd jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat button, the Q&A button, please. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them to the panel to consider later on. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you so that we don't get a bottleneck at the end. I hope we have a great discussion. I'm sure we're going to. Hand you over now to Sandy.
Thank you, Mike, and a good day to everyone. We have a distinguished panel indeed with a great variety of backgrounds and preoccupations. So I'm especially pleased to be working with this group of people. To introduce them ever so briefly in alphabetical order. Keith Amy is in the north of England today, and he is an engineer. He's had a career with British Rail and British Aerospace. He's designed locomotives, which I find an extremely impressive thing to have done during one's career, among other things. And he worked with the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority at one point, and that's an issue we're going to take up very soon. Tina Fawcett is the acting energy program lead at the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University in the UK, and her research notably concerns energy use by households and organizations. How are people using all this energy we're trying to provide? David Jones, former Conservative Member of Parliament from Wales. He has been on our programs previously and contributed much wisdom from the standpoint of someone involved in the public's business, and which he continues to do now as a retiree. I don't know if retiree is the right word, but he is in Wales, which he represented. Roger Pielke Jr. is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He comes to us today from Boulder, Colorado, and he is particularly interested in the politicization of science, government science advice, and energy and climate. I'd like to go to Tina first to tell us a little bit about sort of world energy use patterns, to the extent that you know some. I know you're especially knowledgeable about the UK, but how responsibly does the public in any particular country or overall use the energy that's provided for it? Tina.
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that world energy use as a whole is still going up, and most of that energy use at the moment is fossil fuel energy use. So although we're increasing our renewable electricity generation, there's still this very serious environmental problem, well, people problem that we're facing around climate change. And what we find about people is when there are global surveys of public attitudes and opinions, most people are very or somewhat concerned about climate change and think things should be done and think they themselves should be doing things as well. So people do want to act. And if they're given the right opportunities, incentives, they can act. So we've seen in Britain, for example, that household energy use per household over the past 20 years or so has decreased by about a quarter. And that's largely because of energy efficiency supported by a range of government policies. New technologies come along, more efficient ways of heating your home, doing lighting. So the public have been somewhat involved in adopting all these more efficient technologies and putting solar PV on their roofs and things. But if we're going to get to net zero, there's probably more technology changes that we're going to have to work harder to persuade the public that these are good for them and that it's something that's really going to give them a lot of benefits.
The UK has banned new coal mines, I understand.
I'm not sure if that's quite how they've phrased it in the legislation, but I think it's fair to say there's unlikely to be new coal mining in the UK. There was one off the coast of Lancashire, but somebody else might be more up to date than me on where exactly that stands.
Whitehaven.
Yeah.
Well, actually, let's go to you, Keith, right away. Do you as we said the other day, there's a lot of wind blowing up in Scotland near where you are, and so there must be a temptation to think about wind-generated power. What do you see as the pattern emerging, and whether it's going to be a success?
I think the emerging pattern is that every country is going to have a different mix of power and the use of their natural environment. So a windy area, maybe a very large area with plenty of solar power. Each mix will be very, very central on that capability. So I would expect somewhere like Saudi Arabia to have lots of solar power. Britain needs lots of, can use a lot of wind power, but we haven't got the land. So we're using the sea as a source of wind power. Places like Japan are very limited again, so they would probably tend towards more and more nuclear. So yes, it's very dependent on what natural capabilities you've got for the country. It's worth remembering that if you imagine a very small nuclear reactor, let's take a 300 megawatt one, and then look at the same energy output using solar, it would have to have 1,000 times more land. If you then try and do the same thing with wind power, you need 10,000 times more land. So if you've got a very populous country, you're more likely to head towards nuclear. If you've got a less populous country and plenty of sun, you tend to go for solar, and so on.
Is nuclear power regarded as a renewable form of energy? It does use the uranium after all, so
Yes, I would say no.
it's not. So it's sort of in a category with coal then.
No, it's in a category by itself,
I see.
I would say.
And you were in the business of decommissioning nuclear power some time ago.
Yes.
Have you switched to favoring a revival of nuclear power?
I've always been in favor of nuclear power because of its size and its effectiveness. The safety rates are very, very high. If you look at a number of sources such as coal, gas, etc., nuclear is probably one of the safest sources of energy. Solar is probably slightly better, but only slightly. But the difference in greenhouse gases given off by both, there's about 50 to 60%, at times 50 to 60 times difference between nuclear and solar. So nuclear sort of hits all the targets. The only snag is that it has a popular myth associated with it over its
Right.
safety.
Right. And a
But
powerful one at that.
yes, yes, if things go wrong, boy oh boy, they go mega wrong. However, modern reactors are designed such when they do go wrong, nothing serious happens. It's called design in depth.
Well, that's reassuring. Let's
Yes.
switch for a moment to the politician among us, David Jones, and whether he thinks that the political dialogue around energy use is evolving in a manner that it needs to. There are free speech issues here, of course, about energy companies and whether they are allowed to say anything they want to without having to meet any kind of standard of truth. Of course, under the First Amendment, people can say just about anything in this country. David.
Well, Sandy, thanks very much for that. And of course, we in the United Kingdom have got the luxury of a non-written constitution, so we don't have to worry about things like the First Amendment. But looking at it from this side of the Atlantic, it does seem to me that the First Amendment is something that is capable of interpretation quite flexibly by judges of your Supreme Court. I think that the ultimate standard must be that it's something that if a statement is made, it has to be objectively verifiable. And if it's not, then questions will be asked. But I'd like to get back to the points that were made by Keith, if I may, because I think that the issue of energy and energy security is one of the leading political issues in this country and probably in your country too at the moment. He mentioned nuclear power, and Wales, where I live, has got a long history of nuclear generation. We've got the site of the decommissioned site of a nuclear power station at a place called Trawsfynydd, and we've also got another decommissioned site in a place called Wilver, which is just on the coast, fairly close to where I'm sitting at the moment. And interestingly, the populations of both those communities would very much like to see new nuclear power stations being built there. And in fact, there are now proposals for small modular reactors to be built at Trawsfynydd and at Wilver. The issue of safety, of course, is paramount. And a few years ago, I flew over the site of the Fukushima disaster in Japan. And whilst, Keith is correct, if properly operated, these things are terribly safe. We mustn't forget that Fukushima resulted in tremendous environmental damage, which ultimately was the cause of Germany scrapping its nuclear program altogether. And I'd like, if I may, later in this discussion, I don't want to hog the conversation, but I'd like to discuss other forms of renewable generation that are being pursued, certainly in this part of the world. But perhaps you'd like to discuss that.
Yes, I would like to come back to that, Roger. I want to ask you, somebody who's also been involved in the political side and the sometimes quite lively debate over these matters. Are we exaggerating this as a crisis? Is it as serious as many people say? That, I mean, if energy use increases by 50% in the next 25 years by mid-century, that sounds pretty dramatic. Is it accurate?
Well, first, let me just say, Sandy, Michael, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Tina, Keith, and David, it's great to be alongside you. When I start my energy policy classes, the first thing I do with my students is introduce them to the real scale of energy consumption and humanity's footprint on the planet. There's probably 2 billion people around the world who enjoy energy services as reliable and inexpensive as we do, and probably many of the listeners today. There's more than 5 billion who don't. And so there is a pressing need for the expansion of reliable, inexpensive, safe energy access around the world. At the same time, the way that we've been consuming energy, 80 to 85% right now as fossil fuels emits carbon dioxide. It's not the only factor that impacts the climate, but it poses significant risks for the future. And so we have crises pulling in opposite directions. In one direction, we need to provide vastly more. I like the title here, colossal, a colossal amount of new energy and energy services around the world. And at the same time, we want to reduce that impact to the extent possible to limit risks to the future. And that's why it's such a difficult problem and why people argue about it, because energy is everything. And so there are a lot of legitimate and diverse points of view on both energy and the impacts on the environment and on people.
So are you hopeful at the moment that people are dealing with this issue, talking about this issue in a responsible way that will lead to perhaps more effective and serious thinking about how to mix all these sources together than there's been evidence of in the recent past?
Well, I think to be a policy scholar, you need to be constitutionally optimistic. But yes, I am optimistic. I do think that the discussion around climate and energy has been fraught, and there have been very strong points of views. But at the same time, as Tina says, there are good evidence of progress being made, both in becoming more efficient in how we use energy and developing the technologies of energy production and consumption that keep the trend of decarbonization of our economy ongoing. So one thing people have to recognize is that achieving net zero, pick your favorite date, 2050, 2060, 2070, achieving net zero is a many decades, maybe the project of a century. It's like extending human lifespans or improving agricultural productivity. It's not going to happen with one piece of legislation or one leader overnight. It's going to happen through sustained incremental progress, steady and surely over many, many decades.
And it's in that small, well, maybe not small, but it's in that category of problems and issues that the people working on them now will not likely be alive to measure whether they succeeded or failed.
That's almost certainly the case. And climate has been called a wicked problem. It's one that we can do better or worse on. I don't think there will ever be a moment where we say, all right, solve that one. What's next?
Yeah. Tina, coming back to you, would you say there are countries you're aware of, be they in Europe or someplace else, that have made very responsible progress? It sounds like the UK has, in terms of cutting consumption, at least marginally so, in households and things like that. But if we were to, if we were to look for a world energy czar, what country would we go to?
Yeah, I mean, interesting question. So I think as we've sort of already started discussing, there's sort of three typical things that people think about energy policy for: the sort of energy security, energy access and economics, and environmental sustainability, let's say. And they're often called a trilemma, like how do you meet these three goals at the same time? And there's an organization that creates a world trilemma index, and the countries that tend to come to the top that are doing quite well on all three elements, the sort of security, affordability and access and environment, are mostly sort of European countries, mostly Northern European countries. The Scandinavian countries tend to do pretty well, and North America as well. So there's lots of countries where you can see progress on generating more electricity from renewables, where they've reduced demand, where they're making a switch to electric vehicles. And I mean, the great thing about the switch to electricity for, say, heating and vehicles is that it's not only is it, if you're using the right sort of electricity, lower carbon emissions, it's also a lot more efficient, right? So you need less energy to move a car around if you move it with electricity than if you move it with petrol or diesel. So there's lots of good stories to tell, but and that's a source of optimism, because we can always find good examples in some sectors in some places, but overall as a world we know we're not changing fast enough. I mean, Roger made this point that this is a decades-long transition, and I'd agree with that, but that doesn't mean it's not super urgent, and it doesn't mean we should be doing more and making the most of these good examples we've got and pushing them harder, because, you know, we're at serious risk at the moment in, you know, having a planet that is very difficult for us to live in a lot of places because of the change that climate, you know, because of what will happen due to climate change.
You know, I drive a hybrid car and I'm very
Mhm.
self-righteous about it. I think I'm making this great contribution to energy conservation. Is that, am I right to make
Well,
something of that, or is it just a kind of conceit?
I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not a total expert on hybrids. What I understand is it depends how much you use it in electric mode. If you mostly use it in fossil fuel mode, then it doesn't do that much. On the other hand, symbolic actions might be a start for you. You might have started doing that thinking, oh, I'm somebody who does things for the planet. Maybe you've also insulated your home a bit more or taken some other actions. I don't know. But
Right.
yeah,
Symbolic actions committed. I'm intrigued that nobody has mentioned water power yet. Good old-fashioned hydroelectric power. Is there anyone, Keith, is that something that you have some knowledge of and would like to
A
speak to?
little. Canada is big in hydropower. Northern Europe, Norway, Sweden. And I suppose on a slightly different subject, tidal power. The Faroe Islands generate 1.4 megawatts of power from, yes, their local water. And they're number 3 in the world, Russia and China being 1.7 megawatts. But
Can
that
you
seems to
explain
be,
tidal power to us? I don't know.
yes, it's where you have some sort of barrier which detects the water height and generates electricity as water flows through electrical generator turbines. So you have a barrier. You then allow water to flow one way through the turbines, which generates electricity. And then as the water goes back, you then generate electricity on its return. The only snag with tidal power, well, there are 2 snags. The first one is you've got to have the right circumstances to actually have one. And secondly, they're quite expensive to build. And a lot of the technology is quite seriously affected by weather conditions. So if you have heavy storms, it can make them very difficult to build and maintain.
I
Roger,
wonder if I could add to that, please, Sandy,
yes,
because
David.
I've been for some time a great enthusiast for tidal power. In fact, the window I look out of at the moment looks over the Bay of Colwyn, where there was a proposal some time ago for a new tidal lagoon, which would have generated about 2.2 to 2.5 gigawatt of energy, which is
Wow.
the equivalent to 2 nuclear reactors. There are significant problems with them, there's no doubt. I mean, there can be environmental problems and all sorts of things, and also the usual political resistance from residents. But I certainly agree with Keith that tidal lagoons should be looked at very seriously. And in fact, there is a US expert called Ullman, who has taken a great interest in these, and in fact, who gave evidence to a committee I was sitting on in the Commons some years ago. So I'd just like to endorse what Keith says. I think that there can be tremendous benefits from tidal power. The problem is, as he says, is that they're tremendously expensive to build, and it takes quite a long time to recoup the cost.
I'm intrigued by the fact that Mike Scott, John McCabe, and I have invested a considerable amount of time not trying to become experts, but trying to be knowledgeable and shaping and guiding this conversation. And at least for me, tidal power never once came up. So I don't know whether that should give me hope or just or despair.
I think that it's a technology that's still being developed, and as I say, the issue of cost is one that has to be overcome. There's no doubt that they're tremendously expensive projects, and you have to look at them over a 120-year term at least.
Roger, you're in Boulder, Colorado, which is the home of the University of Colorado, and known as a very active place politically. And so I wonder, what is the profile of the debate amongst the students, the faculty at a great university like UC Boulder on these issues? Are people still engaged in fighting fossil fuels, or is there some, have they gone beyond that to some discussing politely with excuse me, with each other some alternatives?
Yeah, so I spent 24 years on the faculty at the University of Colorado Boulder and 8 years at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, also here in Boulder. Boulder is probably, if not the, one of the top places for expertise in energy and climate issues. And there's, one of the things people should understand is that the discussion among experts is much more rich and nuanced than what you'll get if you go out on Twitter or, even in the mainstream media, where things tend to collapse into, good guys and bad guys. I'm really encouraged by, the fantastic expertise in the climate science community, but also, as, was mentioned with tidal power, with people in the private sector and public sector looking to advance energy technologies in a way that reduces costs, increases reliability, and decreases emissions. So that, in the United States in particular, expertise and universities have taken a beating lately, and and the current administration is piling on. That's for sure. But there is a lot of good, healthy discussions going on, and that's encouraging to me.
So will we continue to see confrontations that have attracted a lot of attention in the speech community over trying to shut down pipelines, trying to prevent new fossil fuel projects, shipping oil, gas, etc.?
Yeah, I do think that I appreciate enthusiasm that people have who are advocates for a cause, but the idea that we can shut down fossil fuels by blocking pipelines or trying to limit supply, if you just take a look at the simple mathematics of the global energy system, all that's going to do is displace where the supply comes from. So if, for example, United States shuts down its fossil fuel production, it'll go to the Middle East, it'll go to Russia, it'll go to other places around the world, because if given a choice, people will want energy rather than not have energy, and they'll want cheaper energy rather than more expensive energy. So the route to, as Tina says, as quickly as possible, moving off of fossil fuels is to develop alternatives that can replace them at lower costs, at same or better reliability, and not sourced from volatile places around the world. Again, that's a big, complicated challenge. It's not as simple as just stop oil.
Yeah. The speech implications here are very, very complex, because there are still, the offices of university presidents are still being occupied by protesters someplace today, I imagine, or if not today, then next week, asking that the Board of Trustees present a plan to phase out fossil fuels, use of fossil fuels, investment in fossil fuels. It's sort of yesterday's issue, but not completely. So how does that get changed?
Well, I'll be happy to talk about that. My university faculty passed a divestment proposal. And I guess the first thing to realize is that, for better or worse, universities are not big political actors, really on anything in the world except for universities. That's a
very deflating remark, Roger.
Yeah, well, that's maybe anyone who's been in a faculty meeting, maybe that's understands that's probably for the better.
Right.
But but what politicians of any political party need are options, and they need options that are technological, but also policy options for energy consumption that make sense and meet all of the different legs of the stool of energy policy. And reducing emissions is one of those legs, to be sure. And if we experts become polarized ourselves, we kind of limit our ability to develop and provide those options to decision makers.
There are interesting trends emerging. British Petroleum, and I'm not sure it's called British Petroleum anymore, maybe BP, but it recently said it was going to slash its investment in renewable energy and increase annual oil and gas spending. That seems to be running against what's necessary or what's desirable. And Tina, do you put much stock in the importance of such shifts by these major players? I mean, BP is a pretty big company.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is disappointing. It's not that long ago that they were, I mean, it's well some time now, but they were branding themselves as Beyond Petroleum, and they were investing in renewables and so on. But they've obviously decided that's not their core business, which is a real shame. But maybe that's what tells us is that the sort of the private sector that's going to lead us towards the renewable energy transition is not the incumbent oil and gas businesses, because some of their assets are going to have to stay in the ground. We've already discovered more oil and gas than we can ever possibly use if we want to live in any sort of sensible climate that humans can cope with, right? So, to some extent, those companies, if they just say, well, that's it, we're doing fossil fuels, and if they they're going to be the losers, because they are going to have to go out of business. If they're unabated fossil fuel companies, they have not got a long-term future. And it's disappointing that BP don't want to diversify, but that's what that means is other companies, for example, there's massive production of solar PV coming out of China, and that's that's generating electricity from solar PV has dropped in price massively for all sorts of reasons. It's expected to continue to drop in price. The study's saying by 2030 it will be the cheapest form of electricity generation almost anywhere in the world, except the very top of the Nordic countries where they've got a lot of wind. So, there's new and the second cheapest in most places is wind turbines, and all the new materials that are going into building ever bigger wind turbines, offshore wind, floating wind. There's all this new technological development on the supply side that's going to replace fossil fuels, and it's a shame those companies are walking away, but maybe they're not the ones who are ever going to lead this transition. Maybe it's other companies that we need to look to sort of bring forward the new technologies and the sort of growth in that.
Should there be some sort of monitoring of what these massive energy companies say to try to detect whether they're misleading the public, whether they're diverting grounds for optimism for their own financial interests?
Well, there's certainly some scholars who sort of look at that sort of thing, look at the public statements of some of the oil and gas companies and what they knew in private, how long they kept denying that climate change existed and what they really thought behind closed doors. So there's been quite a lot of that sort of scholarship. But I mean, I suppose there's also just there's a consumer angle. We don't let our companies lie to us about stuff, just because it's in their commercial interest. And
Right.
I guess that some of, it's not the same as individuals saying what they want to say. Clearly there is regulation around what companies can and can't say.
Right. I'm intrigued by the fact that we've come this far in our discussion and no one has mentioned artificial intelligence as one of the great demands on energy now. In preparing for this conversation, I was reading something yesterday about so-called GPU chips, new kind of chips, and that people are putting together thousands of them in a single building. They're pretty small, so I guess quite a few would fit into a building, and that the energy demand that comes from those chips to support major artificial intelligence efforts is bigger than anything else we've known in terms of energy demand. Who on the panel can help reassure us about this?
Yes, the latest figures appear to be 1,000 terawatts of power is required next year for all the data centers. That is just an unbelievable amount of energy. So I think there are two possibilities here. One, we get rid of data centers and decide that AI is not really necessary. It's not worth the energy, which
Doesn't seem
I
like
find
that's
it
going to happen.
very unlikely. And the other one is to actually either put the data centers where the energy is, or move the data, or move the energy to the data centers. If you take the first one, moving data centers to Norway, Iceland, Canada, places like that would make good sense. The other option is very small modular nuclear power stations, which I believe some of the Googles and the Amazons are now considering. These are the ones around about 300 megawatts of power. So they're relatively small, easy to maintain, incredibly safe, and you can put them right next door to your data center. The reason data centers are going northwards, not only is there energy, there's an easy way of keeping them cool in a cold environment, especially if there's ice around. So there are, many benefits to actually move data centers where the conditions are absolutely right for their minimal cost of running.
Yeah, in
In
the United
Norway,
I wonder if
doing-
that
yes.
is. I wonder if that's why President Trump is making acquisitive noises about Greenland at the moment.
I wouldn't
Possibly.
I wouldn't think there's any deep strategy like that. I would say in the United States, electricity consumption has been flat for most of the last 10 to 15 years. And now with projections of data centers and AI, all of a sudden, and it's been a surprise, the projections are for electricity consumption to go up, up, and up. I view that as a positive because necessity is the mother of invention. But Microsoft, for example, announced that they were going to restart 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. And anyone familiar, anyone of a certain vintage probably remembers the China syndrome. And this 3 Mile Island occurred just in the aftermath of that. Symbolically, it's a huge step. In the US, it's almost impossible to build transmission. So, of Keith's options, data centers will have to go where the power is. And one option in the United States is there's a lot of shuttered coal-fired power plants, as there are in the UK. They are already attached to the grid, and setting up a nuclear power plant on that site with a grid connection available is being explored by some of these high-tech companies.
Do we have to worry about the supply of uranium? Will there be enough uranium to do this to help solve the problem?
93% of the uranium the United States gets comes from Russia. And that alone is a problem. There's plenty of uranium in the United States, in Canada. But again, this is one where there's a history of offshoring things like energy production and mining that countries will have to, developed countries will have to rediscover if they want to have rare earths, uranium, and so on to power their economies.
David, almost everywhere, I think two categories of people who don't know very much about artificial intelligence are politicians and journalists. And what needs to be done? I mean, is there some kind of, artificial intelligence for dummies that people can start to learn from, to speak more responsibly about AI and how we're going to fuel it?
Well, I think that they can learn a lot from AI itself. And in fact, more and more politicians these days are accessing things like Microsoft Copilot, Grok. All these AI developments are actually educating politicians who, you're quite right, are extremely stupid people by and large.
I didn't mean to say that.
Who do need to learn these things. But one thing I would say, just continuing our recent discussion, it does seem to me that there are going to be huge demands for energy from AI. But AI itself could be put to work to try to find solutions to the problems of energy demands. Algorithms, maybe improving energy efficiency, could be developed by AI probably far more quickly than they could by humans. And I think that we should be embracing AI. I think that AI is probably, if put to the correct use, is going to be immensely beneficial to humanity, including in terms of energy efficiency.
Well, that's a hopeful sign. We're going to switch in a few minutes back to Mike Scott and the questions come in, but let me remind the participants at remote who are locations who are tuned into this program, if they want to get some questions in, now would be the time to do it in the Q&A button, not the chat button, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. There is one other question I want to pose before I hand back over to Mike, and that's this. What if we fail? What if we can't meet that in 25 years? We can't provide the additional energy, 50% more energy than we have now. What does that mean for my grandchildren who are in single digits in their age still? And what does it mean for the sort of prosperous life that so many people are getting used to? Will we come to rationing of energy if we don't solve this problem? What's going to happen? I don't know who wants
Can
to.
I butt in there and say, I
Please.
don't think there's any issue with energy. There's plenty of it. It's just a case of getting the political will to do stuff. If we need lots of nuclear, we've got to get them to say, yes, we're going to have nuclear, or have more wind turbines, or whatever the favored energy is. There is nothing to stop us producing all the energy we could possibly imagine.
Keith,
We just,
I can't fail to notice the windmill on the shelf behind you in the room you're sitting in, over there to the left, second shelf down. Is that a windmill?
Oh, yes, yes. Yes,
Well,
someone's joke.
and
I was involved in the design of the first 3 wind turbines in the UK. And yes, that's what they came up with.
okay, so thank you for explaining that. And Tina, what if we fail?
Yeah, I suppose it depends what dimension we're failing on and who we are, isn't it? So if it's, the 700 million people in the world who don't have access to modern sources of energy, if we don't get that to them, that's a serious, human quality of life and development failure. The 2 billion people who haven't got access to clean cooking, if we're not able to help that transition for them, that's a serious, very serious impacts on human health and lives and livelihoods. But if we fail to enable those of us who live very energy rich lives to drive ever bigger cars and fly over further distances, I think that's a different category of impact, really. So I think it's about, if there is a limitation on clean energy, and I'm not sure that that's right. I mean, I don't share the optimism of everybody else about nuclear, but I'm certainly very optimistic about PV and wind in terms of price and availability. You know, I'm not sure that that's, you know, supply is necessarily going to be, doesn't have to be a real problem, but it's making the transition fast enough not to get these major environmental impacts. I think that would worry me more. That's the failure I think we're more at risk from.
Right, Roger, do you have a disaster scenario?
Well, I would start by saying we've already failed. Energy access, energy security is incredibly uneven around the world. We know, just look at Europe and North America, we know that we can power modern societies with vast amounts of energy. And so there are a lot of people, billions around the world, who don't enjoy that access. And so I would say we are in the process of rectifying an existing failure. And I agree with Keith, there is plenty of energy around. Pick your favorite, nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal, tidal. The world will eventually provide full energy services to everyone. And there's a lot of politics in there. There's a lot of competencies. There's democratic institutions work better than others. There's a lot of corruption, but I'm optimistic on that front. Like Tina, I'm a little less optimistic on hitting these very aggressive targets, say for emissions reductions. The Paris target of 1.5 degrees, I think that ship has sailed. 2 degrees is probably on the fringes of possibility. But at the same time, if you take a look at the current policies projections that are out there, there is a wide distribution around them, but 2.2, 2.4, 2.7 degrees might be where the world is heading on its current trajectory. That's disruptive. That will require a lot of adaptation and continued efforts at mitigation. But I guess the good news there is that it's not the apocalypse. So we're going to need a lot more energy to deal with the disruptions that are coming down the line. So again, in general, I'm pretty optimistic that the world's going to be a much better place for many more people in decades to come.
Thank you. And David, your projection here, disappointment or apocalypse?
Neither really, but I think it's a question of politicians actually primarily taking a grip of the issue and pursuing it properly. I'm in favor of more nuclear power. I think that will help preserve energy supply, particularly in countries like the UK where intermittence can be a problem. I'm overlooking now one of the biggest wind farms in the UK, the Gwynfor Mawr wind farm, which is literally, it's straight in front of my window. And that stops blowing when there are large areas of high pressure sitting over the UK, which frequently tend to coincide with the depths of winter when we need as much energy as possible. So I think that we have to be careful to ensure that whatever we do come up with is an intelligent energy mix. I certainly think that wind and solar have a part to play, but so does nuclear and the other technologies that we've been discussing today. And we should be actively pursuing them if we want to make sure that our own children and our children's children don't end up wondering where energy is going to be coming from when they want to boil a kettle.
Right. Thank you. Mike, back to you.
Yes.
I think I see there are some questions waiting to be asked.
Yes, yeah. Thanks to Paul Williams, who's put me in touch with Professor Michael Kelly, who's a distinguished, or in touch with his work, a distinguished academic from Cambridge, who says, as far as the UK is concerned, he doesn't believe that the national grid can cope with the electricity demands of the future. And he says one of the other big issues is that even if it tries to cope with it, the homes, all the homes in Britain, will have to be rewired.
Mm.
I wondered if, David, if you had any view on this.
Mike, forgive me, but that sounds a highly techie question, and I think you need a techie reply. One thing I would say is that I know from the number of wind farms that have been constructed around where I live in North Wales, and as you will know, there are a lot of them, there's a constant demand for increasing the cabling infrastructure and the transmission infrastructure, which is something that does need to be obviously kept an eye on. But I think I'll defer to my colleagues who know more about the technicalities
okay.
of this.
Tina, how do you respond to that?
I mean, yeah, I mean, that's certainly right. There's a lot of we understand that we need to invest in the transmission and distribution grids in the UK, both to bring on the new renewables and to sort of make the transition to using more electricity. So our net zero transition includes moving to electric vehicles and moving to electric, for heat pumps, away from natural gas for heating. So we're going to use more electricity in the future, less energy, but more electricity. So we need to grow the size of the grid. And obviously that's a problem, it needs a lot of investment, it needs a lot of planning, it needs public support. The government's just come out talking about if you live near a big new transmission line, you'll get money off your energy bills. I mean, they're trying to find ways of making it possible for this to happen, both in the investment side, but also in the public acceptance side. And those are big challenges. But I mean, I think on the plus side, somebody mentioned about AI, one of the hopes for AI is it's going to help balance all these new sorts of demands and supplies across the grid in a more sensible way to reduce the additional investment that we need. And of course, energy efficiency helps with that too. So yeah, it's a challenge, but it's not an impossible one. And the engineers everywhere are doing lots of work on how we're going to make this happen.
Keith, do you want to have a go at that as well?
The energy supply system in certain places definitely needs beefing up. A typical, for instance, is on the west coast in Cumbria. We've got loads and loads of wind turbines all working beautifully. And quite often we can't use the power they're producing because the transmission lines south are just not large enough to take the capacity. So yes, we definitely need bigger infrastructure there. With regards to wiring of houses, I'm not convinced about that one because most houses tend to get rewired somewhere between 30 and 50 years as a matter of standard maintenance. So I'm not sure how that fits into the question. Yes, the public opinion seems to be the biggest stumblers to new transmission lines. Do you build them on pylons? Do you actually dig a trench and put the things under the ground? Do you put them in the sea? And nobody seems to want any of those options, but they still want their power.
Right. Okay. Let me go to Roger, I think, to take this one. Although it is about France, Claudio Calogero says over the last 3 to 4 years, nuclear fusion seems to have been accelerating. The first program to be launched was at ITER in France, in Provence. But now there is research in many other places around the world. Where are we up to, in your opinion? Roger.
Yeah, there's the old joke that fusion power is the technology of the future, and it always will be. I call for a stance of technological agnosticism. We're not really good at picking technological winners and losers without actually doing the research, doing the deployment. So fusion should definitely be in that bucket of things that public invests money in to try to advance. But the reality is that the energy technologies of our near future, and by near future, I mean the next few decades, are the energy technologies we have today, only better. And so someone has mentioned that solar has seen tremendous cost declines. I'm incredibly bullish on solar. It's going to expand. The issue, though, isn't the expansion of carbon-free technologies. It's the retirement of fossil fuel producing technologies. So it's not enough just to add nuclear, wind, solar on top of the existing fossil fuel infrastructure. We have to figure out how do we retire existing power plants. And if you do the math, around the world, we need to be retiring 1 to 2 large fossil fuel electricity plants every single day from now till 2050. And so too much attention gets paid to deployment of the clean stuff and not enough to the retirement of the dirty stuff.
Could I come back on that one, please, Mike?
Yes, please, David. Yes.
I agree entirely with what Roger says. And again, this is a question of political will. And what rather concerns me is that China is still using coal-fired power stations at an enormous rate. I think it's built something like 250 gigawatts worth of coal-produced power stations in the last 10 years. Yesterday, we hear President Trump talking in terms of extending and expanding the use of coal in energy generation. You've got the two major manufacturing industrial countries in the world who now appear both to be nailing their colors to the mast of solid fuel coal generation, which I think is deeply dispiriting.
If you take a look at the global data on coal consumption, if you take China out of the mix, it's actually been decreasing worldwide since 2007. I don't think Donald Trump's trying to rewrite the rules of economics 101, and I don't think he'll be able to do that. I think coal is on its way out for economic reasons in the United States, regardless. But this is what I would call the low-hanging fruit of climate policy. I would much rather see the world negotiate a coal exit treaty rather than temperature targets or emissions reductions. Coal is very dirty. The top 30 dirtiest coal plants account for something like 10% of global carbon dioxide emissions. The faster the world can get off coal, the easier it'll be to hit climate targets.
Yeah. Keith, do you want to comment on that and go back to the ITER as well? Yeah.
Right. China is building also loads of power supply systems which are nuclear. I believe 55 are now in production, and they've got another 70 planned. So they're expected to have an 18%-ish supply system which is nuclear right across the whole of the country. Now, nuclear plants, between first thoughts and actual concrete on the ground tends to be sort of various, but they are making a major change to the energy mix in China. So it's not just the coal that's increasing, it's lots of other things as well.
Thanks very much. Tina, have you got a view on this?
Well, just to, I suppose, to sort of repeat Roger's joke about fusion, really, it's always kind of 30 years in the future. And we had a talk, we have a thing called the Oxford Energy Network, and we had a talk by a company who are kind of working in the nuclear fusion space. They sort of develop various components and bits of technology for all the different types of fusion experiments. And they were, obviously they're making a business out of this, and they were saying they thought 15 years before you'd got setups that were demonstrating sort of that you could get more energy out than you put in. So that's, but that's not full commercial fusion. So I mean, I think they're amazing science and engineering projects, but it's very hard, with the best will in the world, it's very hard to see them adding much energy, if any, by 2050. I mean, they may be a long-term technology and we should keep investing in them, but they're a long way off at the moment.
Thanks for that. I'll go on to another question that's come in from Molly Helmuth. Thank you, Molly, for your question. Oh, I've just lost it. Here it is. Molly says, when we talk about energy use here in the US and globally, it would be great to reflect on data centers. Massive new investments mean that just in the US, the share of total energy use could move from 5% today to over 9% by 2030. Data center construction is already having impacts on sustainability initiatives in the building sector. There are knock-on effects to consumers. Is this the biggest energy, climate, sustainability challenge that we face? Roger.
Yeah, I had a chance to sit on a panel very recently with one of the founders of OpenAI, who does ChatGPT, and a question was posed to him: how much more electricity do you think your company and your industry will need? And his answer was, "We'll take all of it. We'll take whatever extra electricity can be produced. We can find a use for it." That said, the increase in AI and data centers certainly is going to increase electricity consumption in the US and in Europe and Asia, around the world. But it is a drop in the bucket compared to the increasing energy consumption, electricity as well, among the billions of people who do not currently have access. So any reasonable projection going forward of future electricity consumption and energy consumption on the planet is up, up, and up. It may not be as high as the highest projections, but it's certainly going to be much more than today. And AI and data centers are just one part of that larger picture.
Thank you for that. Any other comments on that? David, you?
Yeah, well, just a brief comment. So far as I can see, AI is accounting for an awful lot of energy consumption. The thing I find remarkable is that so much of it seems to be applied towards the mining of cryptocurrencies. A lot of data centers in Iceland, for example, are dedicated to what seems to me to be a very strange pursuit of coming up with more Bitcoins. And I really wonder how desirable this is. I know that President Trump thinks that cryptocurrency is a really good thing. I think an awful lot of people are completely mystified about what cryptocurrency is, and probably would far rather AI be applied towards something more beneficial, such as how to work out how to use less energy.
Thanks, David. A lovely comment. There's a question from an anonymous attendee. I'm curious as to who on the panel believes RCP 8.5 is a good scenario for analysing the future of climate change. And a bit later on, they say, reference for question 3, RCP 8.5 refers to the concentration of carbon that delivers global warming at an average of 8.5 watts per square metre across the planet. Do you want to have a go at that, Tina?
I think Roger's probably much better on this than me. I think RCP 8.5 is a very high emission scenario, as far as I remember, but I'm not actually a climate modeler, so I'm going to stop there.
Okay, Roger, over to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a few comments. Since I've written about 6 papers on this topic, the scenarios that underlie the work of the climate science community and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which are important and necessary if we want to drive Earth system models, they were developed now 20 years ago plus. And the most extreme of those scenarios is what's being referred to here, RCP 8.5. That foresees an economy by 2100 that transitions almost completely to coal. So we won't have petroleum, we won't have natural gas, we won't have nuclear, we won't have wind, we won't have solar. It's all going to coal. And today we know, well, that's not in the cards. It would take a very concerted effort, and no one's proposing that around the world. However, the climate science community and the climate policy community continues to center that scenario in a lot of the research. So it's time for an update, and the good news is the climate science community is in that process. But it's important to recognize that our view from 2005 is not the view from 2025.
All right, thank you very much. And another anonymous attendee says, it seems that the need for minerals is absent from the discussion. Well, it's not, because we've just been doing it with it, but this question came in a little while ago. But goes on, Mark Mills explains that the expectations for new mines to produce the needed minerals for net zero is a fantasy. Could members of the panel comment? Keith, have you got a question, comment on that?
not really my field, but a sort of general feeling would be, yes, we are very short of certain rare elements. Lithium is obviously one of the big requirements for batteries, etc. But the rarer elements for magnets and things for motors, they are in incredibly short supply. So I think, yeah, and they're also in places where getting them might be a problem. China is obviously one big source of both of those types of elements. Ukraine is another one. And I think Russia's got a little bit, but yes, trying to get hold of these elements might be a problem trying to get them out of the ground, and also because of political differences.
Fine, thank you. I'm going to go on to an anonymous question that's come in, another one. What do we think of Just Stop Oil and their methods vandalizing the Radcliffe camera at Oxford, for example, being effective? Should they be allowed? David, I think that's more of a political question.
Yes, I actually think that Just Stop Oil are doing more damage to their own cause by their methods than almost anything I can think of. For example, we had the incident where the soup was poured over paintings at the National Gallery. We had commuters trying to catch the DLR into London, being unable to do so because someone was sitting on the roof of the train. And really, I think that whilst they clearly have got quite a proper point, which they, really should be encouraged to make, it's the way that they make it that causes the problem. And it does tend to turn people off. I think that if you're trying to bring people around to your point of view, by and large, it's better if you do it through sensible argument than really disrupting people's lives and causing damage to important works of art.
Yeah. Paul Williams, he put me in touch with the Michael Kelly quote a little bit earlier, but he's going back to this whole business of the cost. Is really net zero going to be able to be realized? And if it is, when would it be realized? I think somebody said, I think Tina, you said, you mentioned that a bit earlier, didn't you?
Well, I was talking about the relative costs of different electricity generation technologies, and I mean, there are real questions around cost and who's going to pay and who's going to benefit and how that's distributed. But there's a lot of evidence showing that in the UK, we recently had a report from our Confederation of British Industry showing the sort of green technology and low carbon sectors was growing a lot faster than the rest of the economy. There's been a lot of economic studies that show while there might be some short-term additional costs from net zero, in the long term it's cheaper because you're investing in energy generation technologies that have got very low running costs. If you're investing in wind and solar, there's a big, obviously there's quite a big investment up front, and then your running costs are very low compared with running fossil fuel plants, for example. And if that's your vision of reducing energy demand and meeting the demand with a range of technology energy sources, most of which have no running costs, it becomes cheaper, but initially you might have to invest some, and there's lots of debate on whose figures do you believe on what the investment costs are and who bears them, for sure. And that's what political debate is for, right? Sorting out how we pay for things and who pays for what.
Can I, before handing over to Sandy, just ask each of you about the future? Are you happy or lukewarm or very unhappy about the way that we're dealing with the fact that we're going to have a huge demand on electricity in the future, and that we're going to be able to match that demand in our various countries. Shall I start with Keith? So yes or no answer, really. You know.
Yes, I would say unhappy, but for a slightly different reason. I believe energy is a little bit of a luxury. This is clean energy, that is. But if you consider the amount of money spent on environmental protection, which not spending money on clean energy will cause, I think, yeah, we've just got the financial balance wrong.
Okay, I've only got 3 minutes left, so I better just ask everybody else to give a one-word answer. Roger.
Cautiously optimistic.
Okay, thank you. Tina.
Yeah, I think we can do it. It's not inevitable that we will, but certainly in the UK, we're a long way down the road to getting to where we need to get to, and we've got some good plans for making the rest of the transition.
David, last word to
I
you.
think we're doing our best, Michael.
Great, okay. Sandy, have you got any final question or any final statements to make?
Well, that was a diplomatic
Know what
answer
you
from
thought?
David, I must say. And I appreciate. No, we have very little time. We try to get out by 15 past the hour. But I want to thank everybody. We had a range of expertise and some very admirable panelists, people who were fun to listen to, and we appreciate their giving the time and expertise to the subject. Just in general, we thank the infrastructure that supports us at Georgetown University and at Blackfriars Hall and Campion Hall at Oxford. This is 53, I think Mike said, in our monthly programs, and we're very proud of that. And Mike is, of course, the best colleague one could acquire at any price.
Okay, but you haven't given me the price yet, Sandy, but thanks for saying that. Thank you all very much. The next free speech project at Crossroads International Dialogues event in association with the Future Humanities Project will be on Wednesday, April the 9th, when we will be discussing whether Western judiciary can ever be independent. Okay, the next cultural encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, will be on Monday the 24th of March, when one Michael Scott will be exploring cultural encounters in Shakespeare's play The Merchant of Venice. Please join me then. I've almost finished the paper, but not quite. For today, my thanks to all colleagues at Georgetown, my thanks to all colleagues at Oxford, as with Sandy. My special thanks to Sandy and to John McCabe, and also to Maggie, my wife, who helps the administration back here. Thank you all for attending today and for your support for our various series. Thanks to those who've asked questions, and hope we're able to at least include the themes of your questions in the Q&A. I'm Professor Michael Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott or LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Until next time, take care, keep safe, goodbye, and thank you again, all our panelists. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.